Welcome to In the Shadows, a podcast where we explore scholarship and discuss invisible student populations in higher education. We are your hosts, Yasmin, Aaron, and Kate, higher education and student affairs professionals in California. We are also graduate students in the Higher Education Administration and Leadership program at Fresno State. Join us in this episode as we shine light on students in the shadows.
All right, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone. Welcome back to the In the Shadows podcast. My name is Kate Spencer. I'm one of our co-hosts for the podcast.
And my name is Aaron Connor.
Hi, everyone. This is Yasmin. Welcome back.
And today we are going to be discussing student parents within higher education. Now, full disclosure, I am not a parent. But what really inspired me to kind of go this route was kind of talking and hearing from some of our own student parents within our graduate program, just kind of hearing the struggles and the stories that they have kind of with their kids and how that's been going as they've navigated their graduate student career. And so that kind of was kind of like the tipping point for me to kind of look into it and see just kind of what we're missing in terms of our students. And I think it was kind of interesting to find the fall when I found an article that actually started talking about student parents during COVID-19. And it was on Inside Higher Ed, which is one of our, higher ed news journals that we can all subscribe to. And it was actually discussing kind of the life of a student mother as COVID-19 hit last year. And, how it's been going as a student, as a parent. It discussed how one of her jobs actually let her go. And the other one cut back hours significantly. So she's like a part-time worker. And then, you had childcare that was closing down. We had a bunch of childcare facilities that were just closing because it's COVID. How quickly can that spread, especially to our kids? And, her having to navigate providing, in-home childcare, for her kids. And then all of that, navigating being a student, I think for a lot of us having gone through, at least the three of us through our graduate program, our school didn't stop, that kind of kept on as it did. And so now having to still work with a full school load on top of, now I have to, care for my child. I have to figure out how I'm still going to pay the bills when, works are closed, when work's closing. And how do they navigate that? And this kind of led into a few different articles that I was reading that navigated how student parents were trying to juggle these identities. And that was really interesting to find. So to kind of start off, there were a few different resources that I found that kind of gave a real brief introduction of like a basic student parent profile. And I want to share that with you. There was an article by St. Amour in 2020 that was off of Inside Higher Ed that, for student parents, and keep in mind, this is kind of outside of COVID-19, that student parents are most likely to stop out of college. And like within the 6 years that we see, some of our graduation rates being, applied to, within 6 years, a lot of the student parents were leaving without degrees. And so that kind of is a testament to some of the struggles that they might be facing that we, as professionals aren't necessarily seeing. And then even student parents of color, they're being impacted as well. In comparison to their peers, they tend to be, lower income, and they tend to struggle a little bit more. But the bright side that's kind of coming out of all of this research that we're finding is that, man, student parents are just knocking it out of the park. They tend to they're outperforming their peers, their childless peers, like by leaps and bounds. And that kind of shows you that, despite the struggles, that there is a real serious dedication to what they do when they put their mind to their work. I did also find another resource that kind of looked at student parents. It was done by Generation Hope, which is a nonprofit that actually helps college student parents by providing like different support services. So they actually help provide mentors, they provide financial and emotional support. They actually also help their children too, which is interesting because I would never have thought that there would be a program out there that would also help prepare their kids. And really it's more of their children who are like getting ready to go to kindergarten. So like the 4 to 5 year olds. And like that was really great. And they actually did a national student parent survey back in May 2020. And they did note that 1 in 5 college students are student parents. So think about it. When we go to our universities, 20% of our student population, are parents. And for me, I didn't realize that we would have such a huge population. But I guess that kind of lends itself to being, an invisible identity. You're not going to know if somebody is a parent unless they tell you. So in this survey, what they did was they wanted to kind of get an idea of, how student parents were feeling and doing, and how they were perceiving their college campuses. And many of them actually reported feeling really disconnected with their schools. They felt like they weren't welcome. They felt that they weren't family friendly. So they felt like they couldn't bring their kids to these institutions. And as we know, if we're parents, ourselves, family is obviously going to come first. And so if something falls through, if there isn't childcare, there was 60% of the respondents that said, no, we're going to skip class to take care of our children. And so you can kind of see how these other responsibilities, which completely valid, do have an impact on their student identity. Not only that, but 60% of respondents weren't actually aware of any, child policies for our classrooms. So, we've been lucky enough to be in a program that says, if you need to bring your kid to class, do it. But there are some students who never saw that. So they weren't aware that they can even bring their kids to class. Not only that, but 75% of them didn't even realize childcare costs could go into how they receive financial aid. And so there's a lot of information, it seems like, that's kind of being left out on what we provide to our students. And to know that, what's out there that can help support our students. And so it really begs the question, like, what are their actual experiences from their point of view? And so this kind of goes into our research portion of our podcast. So I went in and I wanted to look at different pieces of scholarship that looked at different student levels. So I wanted to look at, how our undergraduate student parents kind of navigating this arena, how our graduate students, how our PhD students navigating being a student parent. Like, it doesn't matter what level you are. If you're going to school, you're a student parent. And so I wanted to share with you some of the research that I found. There was a study done by Lavelle and Scott in 2020. So a lot of this research is really recent, which is nice. That actually looked at single parents in community colleges. And they wanted to look at the angst that, these single parents felt as they tried to balance their roles. Now, single parents are really unique in that they don't have, a partner to really be able to share the responsibility with. So everything is kind of put on their shoulders as being the one everything for their kids. So in their study, they interviewed about 12 students, and there were a few different themes that showed up. The first thing was a huge importance on time management. being able to recognize that I have this much time to do homework, I have this much time to dedicate to my kids, whether it's making sure they're ready for school or to go to bed, homework. Um, that ended up being a really important theme to at least trying to navigate being a student and a parent. Um, they did also note that the respondents um, were feeling really taxed, you know, trying to navigate these balancing identities was affecting their physical, their mental, their emotional well-being. And a lot of that came from being, again, the one parent. That's a lot to put on one's shoulders. So I can only imagine trying to do that while, raising a child. They also felt, and this kind of goes back to time management, that there wasn't enough time. And how does that work out? How do we navigate, not having enough time in the day and then feeling guilty when we can't, give the attention needed to our students, or not our students, but our kids. So from there, students also reported feeling really isolated. You have all these responsibilities as a single parent and feeling like you can't reach out to people for help. And they noted that they weren't practicing self-care and that there was an increased need to feel like whatever they were doing was perfect. And so that's kind of what they looked at. And I do want to preface that in a couple of these other articles that I read and I'd like to share with you was that this is not the only study where similar things like this were coming up, this angst and stress about trying to have enough time to literally do everything. And so another article that I had was we're kind of moving up the ladder, looking at undergraduate students at 4 years and feelings of uncertainty. So this study was done by Sharp, Cooper, Warwood, and Dorrance Hall in 2020. In their study, again, they did undergraduate students. They wanted to know that uncertainty really impacted what they do as students. So they felt a lot of stress trying to juggle as having that mixed identity, being both a student and a parent, that you wouldn't just get if you were a student or just a parent. And they also noted that sometimes their identities would exacerbate one another. So their identity as a student could definitely exacerbate problems, like, one of them trying to maybe get homework done, but then, that's sacrificing time with their kids, so there's a lot of issues with that. So to help with these uncertainties, some students actually found ways to kind of navigate them. So they started taking advantage of government assistance programs or childcare options that were available to them. They also started really looking into like different resources that were available to them. During this time, they also tried to stay productive. They said that they would rather avoid trying to not be paralyzed by not knowing what the future is. So they tried to stay productive. They made schedules. They did anything that they could just to stay busy. And what was interesting was that this was one of the only research articles that I found that actually noted them saying, I just needed to take a break. And they actually said, being able to not have to worry about school, not worry about, their kids, even though they're always going to be worried about their kids, but not worrying about their kids, it allowed them to decompress and be able to come back to whatever they were doing fresh and renewed, and not having to feel like everything was on their shoulders, for even if it was just for like an hour. And so that actually proved to be a really big benefit for them. Another article that I found as we continue up our ladder here looked at graduate student parents, both in master's and doctoral programs, that looked at perceived discrimination with regards to kind of their work and family. This was done by Dolson and Deemer in 2020. And kind of what their summary was that, some student parents felt as though they were being looked down upon, or that they were less dedicated to what they were doing because of the fact that they had responsibilities to their families. And for me, I kind of thought to myself, well, how can you ask them to do more? They're raising a little life here. So it was interesting to kind of read that article to see, like, no, they were seen different for the fact that they were parents. There was another article that I looked at by Sally. This one's a little bit older, back in 2015, who actually looked at graduate students in student affairs programs, which was really interesting because that's kind of what we're in. It was a higher education student affairs. I'm like, wow, this is really interesting because we've been reading about what it is to begin higher ed. And with that, we all kind of know that, student affairs, has a significant impact on our schedules, depending on what area of student affairs that you're in. If you kind of think about, our functional areas, financial aid or just other services kind of work from like an 8 to 5 schedule. But then if you think about, student events and that sort of stuff, you could be working weekends, you could be working evenings until, 1 o'clock in the morning, so knowing that actually has an impact on some of our students who are going through, our student affairs programs, and our parents. And so what Sally did was interview some of the graduate students, and how they kind of had to deal with that, because again, student affairs is really unique. So the students noted that they would have to compartmentalize their roles as a way to balance tasks. So there would be certain times that they would dedicate to certain roles. They would set time aside to work on certain assignments. So if they were able to put their children to bed, then that would be the time that they would start working on homework. And that could be 8, 9, 10 o'clock. But they had to do what they had to do to get their work done. And then just being a parent impacted kind of the work that they would do within their programs. So they might be really interested in a topic that they could write on, but if it was really involved, they were less likely to do it. So if they wanted to do a less involved topic, it might not have necessarily been what their interests fell under. So the amount of time that would need to be put forth actually impacted what they would end up writing on and studying. Not only that, but if you think about it, kind of as I said earlier, your role as both a student and a parent, especially being a parent, impacted what kind of job you would go for. If you're somebody who's really interested in doing student events and getting really involved with student engagement, you might be less likely to take that job because once 5:30, 6 o'clock hits, you have to go home and do your parental duties. You have to take care of your kids. And so those students would be more likely to choose topics or areas of expertise that didn't necessarily fit with what they wanted to do, but knowing that it would adhere to a more 8 to 5 schedule. So with that, I know I just threw a bunch of different research at you, but I hope that it was a lot of different things to read and a lot of different levels. And I think it was interesting to note that no matter what level you were at, you were going to find, similar complaints. And maybe complaints isn't the best word, but like similar themes, having to time manage, having to essentially pick and choose what you're doing in order to just successfully navigate life, And so I'm hoping that kind of gets our juices flowing as we kind of start thinking about what we can do to support students. And so with that, I would like to introduce a special guest that we brought onto our podcast today. I would like to introduce Brandi. Brandi, welcome. Happy to have you.
Hi, I'm happy to be here.
So go ahead and introduce yourself. What's your name? What you're doing in school. And then I know that we brought you here for a reason. We know that you've been doing some interesting research and work with student parents. So we're hoping that you might be able to share some of the things that you were doing and working on. So I will open the floor to you.
Absolutely. Well, first, I'd like to start off by thanking Caitlin, Aaron, and Yasmin for inviting me to this space to talk about this very important student population. My name is Brandi Lóera-Mendiola. I use she, her pronouns. I am also a graduate student in the Higher Education Administration and Leadership program, alongside these amazing colleagues that I am having this conversation with today. My area of focus is student parents. I have conducted my thesis research on student parents within this scope of a case study. So I looked at content analysis of websites, internal data programming, social media accounts, different propositions or ideas that were presented to the university, digital photographs of the university that spoke to the welcomingness of student parents and their children. I also interviewed and surveyed institutional agents who were faculty, staff, and administrators that worked with student parents or advocated for student parent support services at the university. And I also got to speak with some student parents as well. I surveyed approximately 65 student parents, and then got to interview via focus groups with 8 folks. So that was amazing. And yeah, I'm excited to talk about some of the findings that I had from this study, but that's a little bit about myself. I am not a parent myself, so I definitely went into this research recognizing that I can't attest to the student parent experience, but nonetheless, I enjoyed getting to learn about this experience from the voices of the folks that are engaged in this work, but also from the student parent voices themselves. So that's a little bit about me.
That's great. And I think it's really nice to have someone outside of the field, or not necessarily field, but like the student populations that we're looking at actually come in and look at what's happening and addressing, because I think that really puts us in a position to be advocates for these students. Just because we don't necessarily identify as a student parent in this case, that doesn't mean we can't make sure that they're not taken care of. And so with that, I want to thank you for the work that you are doing and really giving voice to what these students are experiencing. So if you'd like, I open the floor again. Feel free to share what you've learned. What were you trying to answer when you came with this thesis, and how did the results come about?
Yeah, so one of my intentions with this work was to amplify the voices of student parents, their experience, but also the experiences of the institutional agents that worked for supporting student parents, but also their experience working with student parents. I wanted to provide some recommendations that were tangible, that were actionable, but I also wanted to ground the nature of this study in this idea of, I use it as one of the frameworks in my study, but it's called trenzas de identidades, which translates to braids of identity. And typically when student parents are discussed, it is in this sphere of the identities of the student and the parent are in conflict with one another. They're conflicting, they're competing. The responsibilities of being a student are juxtaposed against the parental identity or responsibilities and the parental identity. And so what I really wanted to do was push back against this. I wanted to use the trenzas de identidades to center that this is a blended identity. This is not something that's easily separated. When folks are in classrooms, they're still thinking about their children, right? When they're with their children, they're still thinking about their academic responsibilities in some cases. And then on top of that, some folks are still working or struggling to find funds to provide the basic needs for their children and the rest of their families. So this is something that I really wanted to bring to the forefront in this work, but also there is no model on student parent servingness out there. Student parent work is a relatively new thing, right? A lot of the resources that Caitlin, you provided at the beginning of this podcast were fairly recent, 2015, 2020, right? These conversations are really starting to gain some momentum and some steam. But at the same time, I wanted this work to create some movement towards servingness and what servingness would entail for student parents. So when I talked with some of the institutional agents in particular, they brought a wealth of knowledge of not only their experience advocating for student parent support services, like things like a diaper distribution. The university I studied is actually one of the few places that have a diaper bank in the nation. And so that is a really interesting connection between diaper need and academic success, right? So when we think about diapers, we typically don't think about the need for access and the expenses of diapers. So with student parents, we talk about childcare being one of the main obstacles and challenges that student parents experience, right? Childcare is definitely one of those things where student parents need to have someone that takes care of their children while they either work or go to classes or even study. But in some cases, some childcare centers require you to have 8 to 10 diapers a day for your child to even be there. And so part of the reason why these institutional agent voices were so important is because they are also pushing back against this narrative of who belongs in college campuses, who belongs on these institutions. And so yeah, like the diaper need, right? But also in my work, also realizing what does a true commitment to student parents look like? So when we talk about diapers and talk about diaper banks being available on campuses, what is the funding? Are there long-term sustainable plans for these things? And in the case of this university, this was the idea of a diaper bank came to fruition because of a local food bank grant that worked with the student pantry to distribute diapers. And that's ending next month. So what that says is that although the resource is there, the institution hasn't invested in long-term sustainable plans to keep these things running, despite 30,000 diapers being administered each month through the student pantry. So we talk about things like this. We also talk about, Caitlin and some of the findings you mentioned earlier, talked about time management. One of the biggest things that I took away from the study was that student parents viewed their student parent identity positively. They're proud of being a student parent, right? We talk about the lower graduation rates that happen with student parents, despite having higher GPAs than their non-child bearing peers, right? This is something that's very interesting. What is the institution doing then if these students are if they're performing well academically, but dropping out, right? So one of the other things that I looked at was this connection to multi-generational impact. Student parents care about their children. They care about involving them in their academic journeys. They care about ensuring that they are well taken care of, that they have access to safe places, to food, but also they recognize that being a student parent is difficult, but that didn't negate from the fact that they loved their children unconditionally, that they were the reasons that they are going through all of this, the challenging times of being a student parent. Some of the students that I had the pleasure and honor of talking with, they were brought to tears when they talk about what it means for them to be pursuing a post-secondary degree while raising their children, right? This is something that is very important because it's not just influencing that individual that is receiving a college degree, but now their children are seeing them graduate. Their children are also reaping the benefits of hopefully their parents getting a better paying job, right? This is something that is very integral and is important when understanding student parents, that yes, they are students and yes, they are parents, but they are here to do the work. They are here to take things seriously. And this is why we see things like time management skills being an essential part of their success, right? We also talk about the disclosure of the student parent identity. And one of these things is we talk about the hiddenness of student parents and why we don't know how many student parents actually exist on many of our campuses. Now, approximately 22% of undergraduate students identify as student parents according to IWPR. And this is a significant amount of undergraduate students, right? 22%. And one of the things that was brought up amongst a lot of my participants, including institutional agents and student parents, was when the disclosure of I am also a parent comes to the forefront. And one of the things I noticed was that student parents, because they're proud of their student parent identity, they are articulating to their professors and their instructors that, yes, I am a parent as well. But they also tended to do this if they experienced more validating experiences with their peers, their instructors. So with COVID, this kind of unmasking or unveiling of student parents happened, right? With the switch to a virtual space, we have the Zoom cameras on. We literally saw into people's homes for the first time. And so with this, we see a lot of children coming into the Zoom cameras. We see folks trying to balance, student parents are having to teach their own kids during the COVID pandemic as well. And so there was this kind of unveiling or unmasking of student parents and realizing how many are actually living this reality. At the same time, there were still some obstacles there. There were some folks that expressed, I had instructors that required me to have my camera on when I'm trying to breastfeed my child, or that they required me to have my camera on at all times, even if they are needing to do other family responsibilities and obligations. We also saw, some students would say, when I had an instructor that was very understanding of my reality at the time, I would say, I have a family-friendly policy, like if your child enters the Zoom screen, that's okay, come as you are, this is just the nature of what we're living in right now. Those things mattered, right? I had an institutional agent that talked about her experience talking with a father on Zoom during office hours, where the father was apologizing and apologizing. I'm so sorry, my kid's here, but these validating experiences can be as little as, it's okay, I have a child too, or I understand what you're going through. Like, this conversation is important that we have. Allow yourself to come as you are, right? These things matter. A lot of participants use this language of, oh, people get it, right? And what they were trying to articulate was when folks understand that they can't separate these identities, right? That they can't just be a student all the time, or they can't just be a parent all the time. These folks that get it understood the complexity of the situation. And in understanding this, they were able to feel seen. They were able to feel validated, not that they needed validation, but that they were seen as their whole complete self, that they didn't have to hide something that was a very foundational part of their identity, right? So those are some of the things that I also found, but in critiquing the institution in particular, we talk about, I selected this university because of the structures of serving-ness it had. It had a diaper distribution bank. It had a children's family clothing closet, an on-campus childcare center. It had a variety of these things, lactation rooms. It had diaper changing stations, but at the same time, the systems that were in place, there were some gaps in this, particularly the inconsistent dissemination of student parent resources. So the student parent participants often noted they didn't know these resources were available to them, or when they did know, they found out by word of mouth or by chance. I had one student parent that said, I didn't even know there was a campus childcare center until I saw some kids being wheeled across the parking lot in a wagon. And I thought, whoa, what are kids doing on campus, right? So they went and asked, and they found out that there was a childcare center on campus. But at the same time, this means that the institution isn't presenting the information on a consistent basis to student parents. Now, one of these reasons is data collection. We don't know how many student parents exist on these campuses, and therefore we can't do targeted marketing. So this is a big issue because student parents aren't utilizing these resources because information isn't getting out to them. And so this is a really big gap in being able to actively serve and support student parents from an informed perspective. So these are some of the main findings that I had from my research, but also this stuff is very relevant to professionals within higher education and student affairs, because if we look at our competencies, right, we talk about professional competencies in our classes a lot, you all know this, there is no functional area for student parents. There is nothing that speaks to how do we know how to serve, or how do we assess student parent programming. There is nothing that talks about this. And this is problematic because in one of my findings was this idea of Title IX violations. And through Title IX, there are certain rights that are guaranteed on a federal level for a pregnant and expecting persons, right? So institutional agents shared having students come to their offices like 2 days after giving birth via C-section, right? Where you are literally under, a very intense surgery where your organs are removed, the baby is removed, and you have like stitches and incisions 2 days after giving birth, because they were told that if they didn't show up, their grade would suffer. That is illegal. You cannot do that. So when we connect this to student affairs practitioners, yes, this is important to address. We need to increase awareness, but also what are we doing so that students are aware of their rights, so that they can advocate for themselves as well. This is not something we talk about. We don't talk about how do we support the advocacy efforts of student parents. We don't do this because these student parents aren't talked about, right? So these implications, yes, there's policy implications, but there's also practice implications as well. So yeah, in my findings, I talk about all of these different recommendations that institutions can do to either implement or enhance their current structures policy-wise, but also what can we do as practitioners and professionals in the field to create and sustain welcoming environments that support the academic, personal, and professional development of these student parents. So those are some of the findings that I have from my research.
Brandi, thank you so much. I think one thing that I really enjoyed kind of listening to your presentation was the fact that you really kind of highlighted a lot of positive aspects about being a student parent, which, you know, in what research that I've done, and I mean, I only shared about 4 articles. I mean, there's tons of it out there, I would imagine, or something akin to it. You know, you really kind of made it more of like a positive, you know, view of what it means to be a student parent. Like you said, these you know, students are very prideful in the fact that they're student parents.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a lot more positive aspects than I think what we present or are presented in other research. One thing that I also did find really interesting on your presentation was the fact that you did include institutional agents. One thing that I did notice was that in any of the recommendations or critiques of what some of our, you know, researchers provided, they really didn't include our institutional agents and advocates and that sort of stuff. So is that something that you might be able to go a little bit more in depth? I know you said it's having people who are advocates, but you know, and I understand that sometimes you might not be able to share it, but were they teachers? Who were your institutional agents? And I guess like maybe just reiterating the point of like why it's important to have institutional agents, especially for our student parents.
Yeah, that's a great question. I will say I was very honored to have some amazing institutional agents have conversations with me in this research. My particular research, I had 1 faculty member and then 3 individuals that identified as staff as part of the institution. And I wanted to include institutional agents, yes, for that reason you just said, Kate. That institutional agents that serve and support student parents aren't really talked about, right? And mostly because there aren't a lot of support services out there for student parents, I'm assuming. And so what this allowed the research to do was I was able to amplify their voices in the sense that in the institutional agents that I spoke with all challenged the ideas or the notions that colleges shouldn't have to accommodate, and you can't see, but I put that in quotations, student parents, this need to accommodate students that are parents or pregnant. And they all pushed back against this. And this was an important piece because in allowing this conversation to happen, we talked about this idea of, you know, the institution's not a welfare office. And I had one institutional agent say, this is what I've heard. I've heard others say this. We're not a welfare office. Why should I have to make an accommodation for someone that chose to have a child, right? And the institutional agents critique this, right? This is something that they're like, no, this is not the case. It is the responsibility of educators and professionals in this field to support and serve the students that are on our campuses. It is not a matter of you get to choose which support services are available to students based on your own beliefs. And so this was why institutional agents were important, because they were sharing, not only sharing the negative assumptions and harmful perceptions towards pregnant and parenting students, but they too critiqued it. And this is something that is very important to talk about, because student parents, although student parents, they view themselves positively, not everyone does. And that's the nature of it. And so this is why this research is important, to challenge that. We know through all of our training and our education that colleges were not meant for parents initially, right? They were meant for that young cisgender white male that gets to immerse themselves fully into the college experience. And that is just not the nature of our student population today. And so this is one aspect where we can see that the way that our colleges and our institutions are set up structurally do not value family. They do not value the idea of being a parent while pursuing your college degree, right? So this is why the institutional agents were important. This allowed me to really connect and draw connections between, if we are advocating for equity and inclusion, or in our competencies, social justice and inclusion, how are we being inclusive towards student parents? And how are we not? And so this is why the institutional agent piece was important, because I wanted to see, what are their experiences? Why, one, do they care about student parents? Two, what have they done? And three, what were the challenges that they had throughout their experience advocating for this? And then supplemented by the student parent voice and experience, I wanted to see how they're experiencing these services on the campus. I wanted to see, what are they actually, how is this benefiting? How is this, maybe not benefiting, or how can it be improved or enhanced? And this is where some recommendations come from, right? The students themselves. So in a nutshell, by looking at content analysis, institutional agents, and student parents, this created a more thorough understanding of what was actually happening at the institution. It wasn't just from one perspective. It was a collective voice, a united front that shed light on this idea that, do we actually exemplify a commitment to student parent population? And if student parents view themselves positively, are institutions looking at them like that as well? And to be frank, they're not, right? They don't see it from, Caitlin, you said one of the things that you enjoyed about this research was that I shed a light on the positive things of being a student parent. Well, it's because it's a tremendous thing. They bring wealth, they bring knowledge, they bring things to the institutions, but folks aren't seeing it this way, right? They're seeing it as, I need to accommodate, right? Which is a very damaging and very uninformed perspective to have, right? So that is why the institutional agent perspective was so important and crucial for this research.
Thank you, Brandi. And along the lines of you talked about how some of the institutional agents you talked to mentioned how perhaps other colleagues around them had this negative perspective of student parents, and how, this isn't a welfare campus. Like, we're not going to be providing these social services to them. In those conversations, did they indicate how they engaged in those scenarios? Because I can only imagine if I were to hear that in an environment that I'm in, like, the first thing I want to do is like, okay, react, right? And sometimes that's not always the best thing to do. Mm-hmm. And so how in those conversations with institutional agents and even student parents, were you able to gather some sense of like what's perhaps, for a lack of a better term, like the best way to respond to those like negative perspectives that are out there regarding student parents?
Yeah, absolutely. So that's a great question, Yasmin. Thank you for bringing that up. Some institutional agent participants were able to kind of dig a little bit deeper into this, and it would shed light a little bit more. But overall, they expressed a lot of frustration, anger, when trying to critique these thoughts that are expressed by their colleagues. Some would do this through their research. Some were actually involved in research on family and family inequality in particular. And so their research was definitely an aspect that they could lean into and kind of critique these notions. But some others, even if they would voice their concerns, right? I had one institutional agent, Diana, who would talk about this idea that even in spaces where they maybe spoke too much and said, hey, this is a social justice issue, right? It has gendered implications. It has, they really critiqued language that was used because student parents, if they're pregnant or expecting students, they are referred to the disability services on the campus, right? And so they even talked about what are we saying about pregnancy when we're having students go to disability services. And so they're really critiquing these things, but it's very challenging. They get a lot of pushback because most folks don't view this as a social justice issue. They don't see the value in student parents. And so one of the things that is very concerning is burnout in advocating for student parents, because folks don't see this in the same way. They don't see the connections between the fact that student parents are very prevalent despite not being researched. And that's another challenge, was that when they would articulate these concerns and say, well, we're not a welfare office, or we shouldn't have to accommodate student parents, or why should I have to change what I do because someone chose to get pregnant, right? These comments are horrible, for one, but also when institutional agents were asked to justify why having, a diaper distribution center or why having a student parent center was necessary, a lot of their leadership would say, well, where's the data? How do you justify this? Well, as I mentioned earlier, we don't collect data on student parents. So it is kind of like a really horrible spot to be put in, because on one end, you have, okay, well, I need data to justify the need, but also the institution won't support data collection on the student population. So therefore we don't know. And therefore I can't get buy-in. And that was a term used by the student parent institutional advocate. They said, I struggle to get buy-in from leadership. And so what's happening is that the few folks that care about student parents on this university campus were the ones that were implementing these student parent resources and sustaining them. So although the institution, if you look at it from a very, surface level perspective, looks like they care about student parents and looks like they support and they advocate for it, it really is only on the backs of a few people that care enough and that will advocate for it and will find ways of funding and supporting these things until the university demonstrates, hey, let's invest in the student population. Let's collect data on this. And so one of the things that I was very strategic about was selecting a CSU. And so within the California State University system, there are no institutional means to collect data on students. They would use the term students with dependents, right? And this is problematic because when we have transfer students that come from a community colleges and then they go into a CSU or a public university, they'll notice differences in support services for student parents. And so there's this big gap that's happening. And so I wanted to be sure that if we're including student institutional agent voice, how are they navigating this? And what are their challenges so that we can push back on this, right? So that we can essentially call out people for their very horrible and misinformed and very damaging perceptions that they have towards pregnant and parenting students. So yes, Yasmin, to answer your question, there was a lot of pushback and a lot of challenging. Some folks could rely on their research. Some would, kind of ask more questions to get people to think things about things differently. But in the end, it would come back to that, well, what do you have to justify the need? And that was often data, and we don't have it. So it's a very compromising and very concerning position to be in.
Thank you, Brandi. I appreciate that. One of the ironic things I think when you are talking about the pushback of show the data, most people are parents.
Yes.
So like I have chosen to be, I'm 35, I've chosen to be single. I'm in the minority. That's not common. So I do find it very ironic that a lot of the people who have these preconceived notions are actually parents.
Yeah. It's funny that you bring that up because 3 of my 4 institutional agents that I spoke with identified as parents as well. But they also spoke to this idea that like, and student parent participants actually highlighted this too. Sometimes the folks that were parents, sometimes they got it more, or they would understand the experience more, or sometimes they were very disconnected from what it takes to actually balance being a student and a parent, because that's very different. Right. So, yes, I think it is actually ironic as well, Erin. So thank you for bringing that up as well.
And I did actually have one question for you, since you did touch on things like social justice, accessibility, inclusion. In your research or in comments with, institutional agents, what did you see about student parents being included in the diversity conversation? I realize that's one identity and it's a multi identity, but is that part of the diversity conversation, since that is different than the, I'm going to put it in quotes, traditional student population that colleges and universities were originally meant to serve?
Yeah. Erin, I think the conversations are changing a little bit, right? So one of the things that I did notice, this is just an observation I had, that just based off of some of the other identities that my student parent participants had, some of them were previously undocumented students. Some of them, well, actually, most of them were first generation students. But when institutional agents, when they talk about student parents, at least the ones that participated in my research, were very aware of the intersectionality of student parents and of individuals in general, in the sense that they understood that student parents will have experiences that transcend and expand into other aspects of marginalized identities. Student parents are most likely to be women, and they are most likely to be single women of color, which will have implications for socioeconomic level. It will have implications for race and ethnicity, gender, right? So these institutional agents were very much aware of these things. But again, kind of going back to Yasmin's question, when they would try to articulate these things to folks, they would often get pushback, right? That there is still this kind of conception that parents don't belong on college campuses as students, right? Because there are these assumptions, and I think, Kate, you brought this up earlier in some of the examples you had, that they can't be as dedicated, or they can't give as much, because then that would mean that the university has to make changes, or the faculty have to make changes so that they can be successful. No, I'm sorry, it's not about that. It is about acknowledging that these student parents have experiences that are compounded by other marginalized identities, right? Their student parent identity may be one of those most salient identities, right? Being a parent. I had one participant say, yeah, my priorities changed when I became a parent. My children came first, but that didn't mean that I didn't care about my academic responsibilities, right? And so our institutions having the same perspective, and based on the findings of my study on a larger level, no, right? And this is one of the things where I mentioned this earlier. Higher education doesn't value family in the same way. They don't acknowledge that family is a strength. It brings a wealth of good, positive things to the community, so that student parents can actually turn back around and contribute to their communities, right? the CSU has the mission statements that talk about preparing and educating all who are willing and ready to receive an education. That's on their website. And so if you really believe in that, well, why aren't you investing in student parents, right? Why aren't you investing in the folks that will give back to their communities? And which is another aspect of their mission statements, right? So yeah, these are some of the things. I think it's starting to become a little bit more talked about, but I still think, again, I think it's just a few people that are kind of planting the seeds of like, hey, what about student parents, right? Because of the large invisibility of this, right? One of the institutional agents mentioned that data will actually inform, I think they use the term like high impact courses, right? And so then that would determine how instructors and how universities actually, provide support services for those particular courses. And so they were talking about, well, if we had data, we would actually be able to see what where student parents are maybe excelling in and where modifications can be made to ensure that student parents are being successful. Where are they dropping out? If they're dropping out, well, let's figure out what's happening so that we can address it. But without data collection, we won't not know that. And so then we will continue to invisibilize and marginalize this seemingly large student parent population.
Brandi, thank you so much for all of the pretty much wealth of information that you're able to provide. And really, again, you're adding to what little scholarship there is regarding, student parents. And so we have to thank you for your good work. Wish you all the best, especially helping like the student population. I think you have a path to go down, especially with your advocacy work. I think you can almost consider yourself your own institutional agent because you are bringing to light these conversations, and it's not just the students, but it's also those who are putting in what we call the good work in supporting them. So I want to take a moment to thank you so much for coming on. We were excited to have you, and we just congratulations.
Well, thank you all for having me. It's a pleasure to be able to talk about the work that I've been doing, and also to just be in a conversation with the three of you. So thank you for having me today. It's been an honor.
Yes, thank you so
Thank
much.
you.
Thank you, Brandi.
Okay, now that we've had this wealth of knowledge, just kind of set before us with regarding our student parents, really having an in-depth look about what their experiences are, what they're trying to do, what they're trying to accomplish, and their struggles. Even though Brandi had pointed out that they love being a student parent and there's a lot of positives, it's still important to understand where the negatives are so that we can now, properly address like ways that we as professionals can potentially move forward, whether it's, advocacy work on our, on our end. What else could we be doing to contribute to their success? What could we be critiquing? And so I know I've certainly talked more than enough. So I wanted to kind of hear from you two, Erin and Yasmin, what are some thoughts that come to mind when we think about, the research that I had, and then, Brandi's, critical input on the student population? I'd love to hear what your thoughts are.
So this is Erin. I would say in consuming the research that you had found, Kate, and listening to Brandi talk, and looking at the presentation she did last week, while student parents is a gender neutral term, and there are definitely more than there are also fathers as well. That's a rising population in terms of single fatherhood. The overwhelming majority are women, and not only women, but low income women and women of color. And I think so much of our support issues really go back to misogyny and the idea that motherhood is something that is at home, the stay-at-home parent, and a lot of shaming, especially if they're single mothers or single parents. So I do not want to leave, um, fathers out of the conversation, but I do want to recognize that the overwhelming majority of participants in these studies have been women. And I think it's a reflection of um, the misogyny that still really is intertwined within our institutions, even though over 60% of institutions are women. So that is something that I would like to see addressed more as well.
Yeah, Erin, that's a great point, and it's interesting to see kind of also like Brandi had mentioned the creation of higher ed was meant for white cisgendered men, excuse me, and how it continues to kind of stem through these um invisible student populations that don't fit that mold and are told, you know what, like we don't care, like we're not going to make accommodations, we're not going to, attempt to try to provide services for you, and it's heartbreaking, and it's kind of like frustrating as a professional when you're sitting in a room and you're trying to be an advocate for students in certain populations that are invisible, and you get this pushback. And a lot of that pushback is, as Randy mentioned, like, where's the data? And it's like, oh, it's kind of like that conundrum. Well, we can't show you data because you're not collecting data. And really, why aren't you collecting data? Like, it's also kind of that idea of like, they're not collecting data because it's not data that will highlight them positively. And so they're wanting to, not show that. And as Brandi was like talking about her experiences, like interviewing student parents, I got taken back to an experience when I was a student. And I had a professor who allowed one of the students to bring in her kids because she wasn't able to find someone to look for them. I mean, to take care of them. And they were older. They were like preteens. They were 13 at the time, and it was interesting to like see them in the classroom as a non-bearing student. It was like, wow, like they get to be in a classroom, in a college classroom, and get to see what their mom does when she's off taking classes. And later on in my academic undergraduate career, I was paired with her to work on a group project, and it was really hard for her to come to campus and like work on the project together. And because she would only be on campus when she had class, and then she would go home. And so it was easier for me to travel to her than it was for her to travel to the campus. And so it like brought me back to that moment where it was, well, what would have happened if the instructor didn't allow her to bring her kids? Like, she would have missed class, and it would have put her in a situation where like, who do I choose, my children or my education? And it's like, why do they have to choose? Why not allow for accommodations? And I think it like stems back to Erin's comment about how really it's based on misogyny.
There was another article that I had read. It was more autobiographical, I would argue, than compared to like a research article, but I think it's important nonetheless. And Yasmin, it kind of goes along, your train of thought, where it's, and I guess Erin too, where if you're a parent, you're like, oh, maybe this isn't like the right time for you to come back. And I mean, this was said to somebody who was interested in pursuing their PhD. And it was really interesting to read it, in that I think too, she was in a different part of her life, because I think there are some differences where if you're like an 18, 19-year-old undergraduate who is a parent versus someone who's going back to school later in life, um, and with those experiences where she was like, I had to advocate for myself too. Um, and being able to say like, hey, I can't come to like half this professional development because I have a kid. I have my responsibilities at home. And so it was interesting to see that when she had actually brought it up, I think it was to her chair, they actually started seeing more events where they'd say, oh, children are welcome, like bring your families. So you started seeing that environmental shift. And in some of the research that I had read, some of the recommendations ended up being, let's change how, some events are perceived. Let's see how we can make them more family friendly, because we want students to participate. In a lot of our studies, we're like, well, let's get our students in co-curricular and extracurricular activities. Let's get them like involved on campus. But then when we look at student parents and you don't give them opportunities, or the opportunities just aren't available. So when we have, I just imagine like homecoming, you have events at night and there's concerts and all these activities, and parents are like, I have to go feed my kid. How do we navigate that? And I think based on everything that I've read, based on what Brandi has provided, to me, I could almost say that I think the biggest part is a change in the institution and how their policies and procedures work. We've had the discussion of, we can't do anything without data. Well, we can't gather data, but what other small things can we do? Do we start doing events during the day when maybe students are on campus and they can participate and make those connections with their peers or something like that? But even then, it's all about buy-in, as Brandi said. Who's going to be the one to say, maybe that is a good idea, maybe we should change it? Or are we going to get the pushback of, well, that doesn't get nearly as much turnout, and we want to make sure that we look good when we have to do our reports? And it's like, but it's not about you. That's kind of how I feel. It's not about you. It's about, if you're wanting students, and especially student parents, to participate and join in on what you're trying to offer as an institution, there has to be some concessions. Now, I'm not saying move homecoming to the middle of the day, but what else can be provided to ensure that we are giving those opportunities to the students who may not otherwise have it because they have their obligations?
I also, in terms of recommendations, the going back to there's no data, one of the things I would really like to see is adding a question on the application. If we're talking specifically about the CSUs, that can be in question on there. The UCs could have this question on there, or other institutions could, but asking if the student does have a dependent or is a parent, if that data could be collected. And here's the kicker: we'd actually have to use the data, because we did add, both the CSUs and UCs did add sexual orientation as part of their application process, within this last decade, but the data is not used. But I think that may not be a perfect way of capturing data, because of course things can change. A student may become pregnant when they're at the school, or a lot of different things, but maybe that's a way of seeing how many students actually are parents on campus. And I wouldn't be surprised actually if it may be more than 22%, because especially at the CSUs, because those are considered, the more everyday, in quotes, campus, where that is our primary serving population. And so I wouldn't be surprised if it were more, because I think a lot of times students don't necessarily bring it up in conversation. So I think that would be an easy way to be able to see, well, maybe this is why we should get a parent resource center, because 30% of our students are saying that they're student parents.
Yeah, you bring up a good point about like the actual use of data and how it's used, and it can, I think, going, like, I think it's not like, yes, we need numbers to how many how many students on campus are part of this population, but also taking it a step further and identifying their actual needs, right? And being able to say, we have this percentage of student parents on campus, and this is what they need, and this is what they're asking for, and this is hindering their success and their retention. And I think, like, to gather like buy-in too, like, you have to appeal to them, like what they're wanting, right? They're wanting to increase their graduation and retention rates, and so being able to have student parent centers and services is going to get them there, because as Kate mentioned, they outperform their non-bearing colleagues. And so it's really a question for the institution, like, with higher GPAs, why aren't they being retained? Well, they need services. So being able to not only like add that question to the form, but then taking it a step further and identifying in a data way. I know that sounds really horrible, but like in a data way to like showcase their services that they need to be successful, so that they can remain at the university and be able to graduate and be successful, because it's that generational wealth, right? It doesn't just stay with them, it proceeds to their children that they love, and is a huge reason why they're going to school.
Just to add to that, Yasmin, really quickly, is the CSU has a basic needs research kind of institute initiative within the whole CSU system. I think student parents can really be highlighted within that, because while all students have basic needs being met, student parents have a very specific type, or specific types of needs that may be met that would help them complete their degree.
Yeah, I think it's important to recognize that even with, our podcast today, that this conversation is really still kind of getting off the ground, as Brandi said. It's something that we're still looking at. And I think it's just sad that it had to take a global pandemic to really start seeing that, here's a population of students who aren't being served. And I think yeah, it's a starting point. And I think by addressing it, we're also contributing to the conversation on what can be addressed and what can be done. I did want to thank my co-host for joining me and listening to all the information that was provided. Once again, thank you to all of our listeners today for the In the Shadows podcast. We hope that you'll continue joining us on our journey as we explore other kind of our invisible identities, or the ones that are in the shadows. So thank you so much, and we hope to have you join us again soon. Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you for listening to In the Shadows, a higher education podcast. We are your hosts, Yasmin, Aaron, and Kate. We hope you enjoyed today's episode and will join us for future episodes. Clear Day, royalty-free music, is provided by Bensound. Visit them at www.bensound.com. Please visit our website at intheshadowspodcast.weebly.com to review the literature and resources discussed on today's episode. Please share any feedback or ask questions by emailing us at intheshadowsinfo@gmail.com.